Good afternoon. This is David Greenberg here. I'm LISC's Research and Evaluation Director, and welcome to our webinar, Partners Against Displacement. So I'm going to be kicking us off by talking very briefly about partnerships between the community development and community land trust movements and how they can scale up anti-displacement efforts before turning over the mic to our guest today, whose expertise helped us generate our recent report, which should be available, I think, on the registration and on the appointment. Before I get there, I wanted to talk just briefly about why LISC is exploring this topic in the first place. And the short answer has to do with the scale of need across the country. So in my home of New York City, on any given day, 10% of children in the public school system are living in a homeless shelter. And across the country, there were 2.3 million eviction filings in 2016. Community land trusts are meant to combat these trends by providing permanently affordable housing that's under community control. Community land trusts, or CLTs, are, as folks know, entities or programs which hold land and govern the terms around which owners or tenants can use it. And in many cases, CLTs use a ground lease to achieve permanent affordability by putting resale restrictions into place and setting guidelines about income eligibility. But most land trusts are, in fact, relatively small compared to the scale of housing need. There are about 225 CLTs throughout the country, and while a few are large and well established, the typical CLT contains about 50 housing units. And in contrast, while this is a deliberately unfair comparison because of the greater public policy support provided, there were over 1 million units of public housing in this country in 2018, whose charge is also to be permanently affordable. The question for us is, given the scale of need around the country for a group like LISC, one reason we are thinking about the CLT-CDC interface or interaction is that we feel these conversations can help each other ask questions about ways to create new pipeline and new resources for permanently affordable housing. So in the report, we talk about three forms of partnerships: investments, the infrastructure of CDFIs, and public policy partnerships. So this slide refers to investments. In the report, we note how CDFI loans and federal capacity building grants, known as Section 4, have been used to support CLTs in places as varied as Arizona, Minnesota, and the Bay Area. The image here comes from Oakland, where a combination of a CDFI loan, together with city grants and an innovative crowdsourcing program, helped with the acquisition of a mixed-use property that will become part of the Oakland CLT. In the report, we also note how both CDCs and CLTs often share extensive infrastructures of support, including intermediaries, technical assistance providers, and funders, and an extensive history of collaboration. We'll be here. This image is of one of Banana Kelly's properties, and we'll be hearing from Banana Kelly today. Finally, CDFIs and CDCs have acted together in support of resident and community-driven public policy campaigns. This image is drawn from Buffalo, New York, where LISC informally supported efforts in the historic Fruit Belt neighborhood that have resulted in the creation of a land trust there. So taking a step back, in 2018 alone, cities newly embraced the CLT model in places as varied as Nashville, Denver, and Tallahassee. This kind of public support, we argue, is critical because while CLTs are vehicles for community control of land, they do not in themselves ensure sustainable growth. And without a publicly supported pipeline of property and adequate funding for rehabilitation, these efforts, and indeed any kind of affordable housing effort, may not reach sufficient scale. Which brings us to this final image of Dudley Neighbors, Inc., which is a project of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston. Dudley Neighbors was founded after organizing by local residents led to DSNI gaining powers of eminent domain, and really one of the only examples of community-driven eminent domain of which I'm aware. And it makes us remember that with partnerships, it is possible to expand on what was previously seen as challenging or even impossible for affordable housing movements more broadly. So with that, we'll turn it over to our experts as to how to build scale and movement. We'll be hearing from a CDC, from a community land trust, and from a locally based technical assistance provider and advocate before turning over to the Grounded Solutions Network for a panel discussion.
Right. I'll take this clicker. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Gregory Jost. I am the Director of Organizing at Banana Kelly Community Improvement Association. We're located in the South Bronx. So I'm just going to walk you through a few slides. I think I'll help explain a little bit about who we are and why we're part of this. Let me make sure I'm getting on here. There we go. Okay, I found the right arrow to click on. So Banana Kelly's been around for 40 years, and at our core, we believe really strongly that having housing that's controlled by local residents is critical to us achieving our mission of being a community-based organization, community development organization. We were actually founded on the model of sweat equity back in the 1970s. So we're structured as what you would call a mutual housing association. And this builds on our long history of residents coming together and collectively fashioning what are the solutions to our different problems, right? So back in the 1970s in the South Bronx, we're talking about an era of redlining, building abandonment, fires. The city was actively engaging in policies of planned shrinkage by closing down fire stations in the same exact moment that the fires are increasing. There's a whole host of kind of these external factors that are impacting folks in the neighborhoods where there have been a really strong community for many decades, many generations, right? So folks, black folks moving up from the South, Puerto Ricans coming up from the island. There were a really strong social fabric and network. We had a really cultural, vibrant scene, a lot of music and food culture coming out of the South Bronx. And these things were systematically undermined through redlining, urban renewal, and planned shrinkage, and what we could call serial displacement. So when folks on Kelly Street, and our name comes from a specific block of Kelly Street that's curved in the shape of a banana. And what it speaks to also is that people have always felt really strongly about their block. And they had like a real strong sense of like belonging and ownership on their block. There might be all kinds of different issues going on different blocks, and you might not feel safe, but once you got to your block, you were safe. You could stop running, people were going to take care of you. And so people who lived on the Banana Kelly block, partly because it was shaped, not, they form in community because if you look at the actual block, you can't see the other cross streets from the middle of the block. Got that curve, so it's very inward facing in many ways. And there was a family that owned a couple properties on the block, and so they were very involved. And folks said, there are these 3 buildings on the block that have gone vacant and abandoned. The landlord's gone. What are we going to do? And it was really taking inspiration from other folks who had been piloting different models like sweat equity. And so the People's Development Corporation, a couple of neighborhoods over, had started taking over buildings. And the guy, Ramon Rueda, over there, had always, his mantra was like, look, we got 2 main assets in our neighborhood. We have vacant buildings and unemployed people. All we need is like the materials. We have the expertise. We can train people on how to renovate buildings, right here and take over buildings ourselves. And Banana Kelly folks were fully inspired by that to begin that model of sweat equity in urban homesteading. And so they took over 3 buildings. People were working on their own apartments. They were getting donations of materials, supplies. It helped when folks came in and did documentaries. And when the president came and visited the South Bronx, people were thinking like, well, let's get these people some materials. And so buildings were renovated. People own them. They still own them to this day. And so through kind of a long history, we really stayed true as much as possible at different waves of the roller coaster that have come and gone over decades, is really thinking like, how do we maintain that strong connection to our, not just our history, but our way of being, about being connected to the folks in the neighborhood, people who live in our buildings, people from historically redlined communities, and folks now we see many folks who were displaced in the past, but also being pushed out of other neighborhoods due to gentrification forces happening in Brooklyn or in Queens or Manhattan. A lot of folks end up in the South Bronx or different Bronx neighborhoods in general. And so we've really seen, as this displacement threat grows and expands and starts moving into the South Bronx with different new luxury housing development, we have to think about how can we up our game on community control. And there's 3 main tools that we've employed around this. So we converted our bylaws to be formed as what's called a mutual housing association. So that means that we organize residents in our buildings, they form a resident council, and the resident council nominates members, residents, to our board of directors. And the seats that we have for our members, they're the largest group on our board of directors. So a plurality of our members, our residents, make up the strong faction of our board of directors. Another area that we've been working on over the last decade has been playing a key role in forming what's called the Joint Ownership Entity of New York City, or the JOE. And the JOE is made up of a collection of a number of different housing nonprofits around the city, and it allows us to leverage our assets together. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. And the third area is strategies around community land trust. And we'll use that in a couple different ways. So I mentioned Mutual Housing Association. When we talk about community land trust as well, it's an intentional governance structure. And it forces an organization, whatever type of work that you're doing, to actually deal with the question of who should be involved in the governance of this asset, this resource, this institution. So when you spell out who's on your board of directors, you're really looking at like, well, what's our intention? It's clearly spelled out, and it's something that can last over time, even amongst like changes that happen in people turning over. So sometimes you might just say without an intent, specific structural intention. It's like, well, we'll have people who are involved in this be on the board. But over time, like, how does that maintain itself? Is it self-perpetuating? You always have to take an active role in it, making sure that that type of governance continues over time. So with revamping our bylaws, this is something that we're very actively and intentionally engaging around, and making sure that we have representation on our resident council from all of our buildings. Well, if we don't, which we don't, right? So this is a process over time. We actually have to allocate resources to make that happen. So the Joint Ownership Entity of New York City that I mentioned, it's a collection of community development housing groups from around the city, and members transfer beneficial title, meaning the title to the actual building that they own. It doesn't have to be all the buildings, at least some of their buildings, into a joint pool. And what this allows us to do is to jointly leverage our assets to increase the purchasing power of nonprofit-owned community development entities. And we can benefit from certain economies of scale in terms of purchasing, but one of the main highlights is that we're able to be in a stronger financial position jointly to acquire new properties. And so as the city has been moving, for instance, with this deal to acquire a number of buildings I won't go too into the weeds of New York City, but for a strategy for a long time with growing homelessness has been converting rent-stabilized apartment buildings into shelters, or at least partially converting them into shelters through a program called the cluster site. And so a lot of organizing work by our member base and partner groups like Picture the Homeless pushed the city to say, we need to phase this program out. And so who's going to acquire these buildings from a problem owner that has been doing a lot of cluster sites for years, and converting those apartments into permanent apartments. So folks who've been basically shelter residents can become leaseholders. And the Joe was able to become the purchaser for that deal. And that's only because we've leveraged our assets together. So we're kind of doing a little bit of cooperative formation of across the nonprofit world in New York City to be able to do that. In the past, we might have had to come together with a for-profit entity to acquire a package like that. So the third model, the third kind of strategy and tool that we're employing are community land trusts. And there's two main ways that we're approaching using CLTs, kind of two different strategies, two types of campaigns. One is that our neighborhood around Southern Boulevard has been identified by the New York City Department of City Planning for rezoning. And in New York City, rezonings often lead to increased investment, but also an increase in displacement pressures. And a lot of upzonings tend to happen in communities of color. A lot of downzoning tend to happen in more wealthier white neighborhoods. So there's different kind of the racial politics of all of it. And really what our member base has been pushing since the beginning of this campaign is the idea of community control of resources, especially the land. And so it's a central organizing theme right now, thinking about how do we push the city to put more land into community land trusts so that we can do the development ourselves in terms of the expertise we have at the table with a network of different housing and other nonprofit groups. And that allows us to target area median income for folks who currently live in the neighborhood as well and prototype some interesting different models. The other area is that we're actively working on moving our buildings into their own community land trusts. So this is where inside the model there's beneficial title of the building and then there's fee title of the land. And so we set up, we fought for this as one of the founding members of Joe NYC to make sure that community land trusts can become members of Joe as well. And the idea behind it is that on the one hand, the percentage of profits of the cash flow that comes back from the buildings inside the Joe can help fund the work of the CLT to do the organizing and kind of help promote cooperative economics and economic democracy. On the ground, we're working on campaigns around community development credit unions and a number of different areas that CLTs can help, our own CLT can help support that type of work. The other areas, as we think about what are the different benefits of having a relationship between a community development entity like Banana Kelly and Community Land Trust is really kind of this back and forth that we'll talk more about today. Thinking about how do we ensure that groups that own and manage housing are really connected to the base in a way that they often were when they first started up. So a lot of our groups are neighborhood-based organizations across, in New York City, I'm sure in many different cities this is true. Folks fought for buildings that were vacant, abandoned, they took control and ownership, and just almost by default in the beginning, those who were involved were people who lived in the neighborhoods who were directly impacted. Now over time, we know that some of those relationships can fade away. People age, sometimes they retire, sometimes they pass on, and if you don't have an intentional structure set up to maintain some of those connections, there can be a growing disconnect. And so today we see there's this increasing organizing push from the base in our neighborhoods around community land trust, community ownership, and those folks are not necessarily connected to the community development world at all. And so community land trusts offer an opportunity for groups who've been involved in community development and ownership and management of housing to really reconnect with the base in the neighborhood, which often in many neighborhoods looks very different than it did when these buildings were taken over 40 years ago. A lot of neighborhoods in the Bronx have, there's been, as you can imagine, a lot of change in 40 years in terms of racial and ethnic composition, and just maintaining those different connections to residents who have a lot of new energy and a lot of excitement around this collective ownership work. And it can really help to serve the community development sector by thinking about questions of legitimacy. When we talk about being community development organizations, what's the community that we actually represent? And how is that built into the structure of organizations? Because if you don't do it intentionally, it's not going to happen on its own. We know that. It's just easier to kind of streamline your operations and do stuff. You can run really great housing, but if you don't have that connection to the base, at some point, we do have to question, like, what gives us the right to do this work and speak on behalf of the community? And working with the CLT, where you've got to actually spell out in your bylaws who's on the board, is a great opportunity to actually name who is the community that we're serving or working with, right? Because it's not just about service, it's about collective ownership. Finally, I'll just share that, that there's a lot that community development orgs have to offer community land trusts in terms of expertise, technical assistance, resources, economies of scale, and political connections and how to do the actual development work. There's a lot of synergies, there's a lot of overlap, and we see from inside of Banana Kelly that we're in a somewhat unique position in terms of a lot of the groups that are pushing CLTs right now, and that we have a ton of community development expertise and resources and already own a lot of assets. And we also know that it's a great thing to have protection over the land, because not every community organization has always acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. We know that there's it's definitely the exception, but there are cases where different nonprofits have gotten into financial trouble and have sold their buildings. And if those buildings were part of a community land trust with that added layer of protection and governance, most likely those sales would not have happened. So I think there's a lot of lessons to learn over decades and seeing the positions that groups have been put in. And there's a lot of real great opportunities for, as we're seeing today, to scale up community land trusts and reconnect community development work back to the base that community land trusts and community development groups partnering together can offer.
Great. Thank you, Gregory. So we'll turn over to the City of Lakes Community Land Trust and Stacy.
Good afternoon. Yep. Can you hear me?
Stacy, did you still want to click through your slides? Because if so, we'll just go ahead and transfer the privileges over to you right now.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. What?
Do you want me to? Should we get okay.
Well, sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Stacy Horowitz. I'm the operations director at the City of the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. We are based in Minneapolis. Just going to pause for one moment because I'm not able to advance my slides.
It should be the tiny little caret under the number on the left-hand side of your screen.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you all. So I'm the operations director with the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. I've been with the organization since 2006, and while I also kind of see daily operations, a bulk of my responsibilities are around the property development for the organization. And I want to start out by sharing just a little bit about the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. Our primary mission is to create community ownership that preserves affordability and inclusiveness. And our organization was started in 2002 by a group of community stakeholders that at the time were very interested in trying to figure out solutions for affordability in the city of Minneapolis. And after looking at a number of different models, the Community Land Trust strategy rose to the top, and we actually started out initially as a program of another nonprofit housing developer. Within about 6 months of our initiation, then we became our own 501c3 and then moved forward to the organization that exists today, almost 16 years later, 17 years later. We serve just the city of Minneapolis, and our goal is 80% or less area median income households. We currently have just about 272 to 275, as we've had some recent closings, of homes that are in the land trust, as well as we've facilitated 65 resales of existing CLT homes. So over the last 14 or 15 years, we've now served over 330 households. Within the City of Lakes Community Land Trust, we have a number of different types of housing. We have single-family homes, we have townhomes, condos, duplexes, and also homes with accessory dwelling units in them. Our average affordability investment is just shy of about $45,000, and that's what we would normally refer to as affordability gap. It's just investment is a term that we started using a number of years ago to try to shift the narrative a little bit about the fact that the funds going into a property were a long-term investment. And then our average household that we're serving still today is about just over 51% of the area median income based on household size. And our average household size is between 2 and 3 people in the household. 56% of all of our households served to date are single female or single female with children. And 55% of our homeowners are from communities of color. And just to put that in a little bit of context, only 24% households of color in the city of Minneapolis own their own home. As was mentioned before about the importance of stakeholder representation at the governance level, our Community Land Trust has what's known as a tripartite board, which is a standard of the model for Community Land Trust, where a third of the board members are existing CLT homeowners, a third are from the geographic area we serve, and then a third of those are also like at-large board members. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Community Land Trust, I'm just going to give you the 60-second version of how a Community Land Trust works. In our case, where it's primarily focused on housing, the goal is to bridge the difference between a buyer's mortgage and the cost of a property. And that's the affordability investment that I referenced just a few seconds ago. And that affordability investment is typically tied to the title of the land via ground lease, if there's a parcel of land to take title to. And in our case, where we've been working with condominiums as well, we have a deed restriction that we can use to tie that affordability investment to a particular property. When the property sells, an owner agrees to income and resale restrictions. And so when a land trust property is sold, it has to be sold to another income qualified household. And just to give you some context of what the resale looks like, the initial sale in the example on the slide in front of you is dealing with a property at about $200,000, and that's the appraised market value of the property. And the individual or the household was able to purchase that property because they were able to qualify for a $140,000 mortgage, and then the land trust, in this example, brought $60,000. At time of resale, and in our case, there is no minimum or maximum that someone has to stay in a home. They can resell at any time. But we look at the appraised value in the future. And in the example, we're showing that $240,000 is the new appraised value at time of resale. And the new buyer is going to buy that home for $150,000 versus $240,000. And how we get to that is if you think of the new appraised value of $240,000 minus the $60,000 we had originally in the transaction, plus there's a share in the change in the market value between the current owner and the property. And so in our case, it's 25% of that change in value is the existing owner's equity, and 75% stays with the land trust property. So I think it's easiest to think about 240 minus the original 60 minus our share of 30 gets us to the 150 sale price. So just to show you some of the housing types in the land trust, these are just some examples of our single-family homes, our condos, the townhomes. We do have 4 rental units in our organization, and that was actually a strategic acquisition for us. It's 1 single-family lot over from our office building, and our goal in the future is to hopefully do a larger development. But we exist in a neighborhood that is ripe for gentrification, and we've actually seen it manifesting over the last couple of years. So in 2012, when this particular 4-unit rental became available through a foreclosure, we actually decided to purchase it, rehab it, and while we didn't necessarily think of it as affordable rental at the time, we now do, in the fact that it's $900 for a 2-bedroom, 2-story with full basement units. So our organization started out in its first decade or so. We did not start out as a developer. We purposely sought out developer partnerships, and that was one of the things that the community came back to the organization when it first started, was they felt like there was a number of developers already in place, and what they really wanted to focus on was the retention of affordability. So a number of our townhomes, even a couple of our single-family homes and our condominiums, in the first, I would say 2 to 4 years, came through developer partnerships, where someone else built the properties and we came in with the affordability assistance to make it accessible to a low and moderate income household. In around 2006, we started a program called the Home Buyer Initiated Program that was modeled after other earlier versions with Community Land Trust. And in this program, buyers are able to go out and purchase a home of their choice anywhere in the city of Minneapolis once they know their purchasing power, which their purchasing power is their mortgage amount plus our assistance. And so they go out with the realtor of their choice, they find a home, the land trust inspects it, accepts the home into the program, and we move forward. And once they close, we do some rehab to address deferred maintenance, code issues, and environmental hazards such as lead, asbestos, and radon. This we did up through about 2012. And as you might expect, working with developer partners and through the Home Buyer Initiated Program, because we never really stepped into title until the home was closing between the existing seller and the land trust buyer, that this was really a low risk and not a very cash intensive approach to development. Yes, we had to come with the affordability assistance. Yes, we had to come with some rehab assistance. But when you look at investing $80,000 to $100,000 in a property versus what's needed to do a new construction today, or even a vacant acquisition rehab, it was really not as cash intensive as we're experiencing currently. So fast forward, 2013, we're asked to actually acquire a home from the city, and we do our first vacant home acquisition rehab. And since then, we've ramped up to doing about 3 to 5 vacant acquisition rehab homes per year, and are doing more new construction, averaging about 4 to 6, just depending on timing of the project. We currently still do the Home Buyer Initiated Program, which continues to be the most popular program through our organization. And of those 272 homes that we have in the organization currently, over 50% of those have come through the Buyer Initiated Program. About 5 years ago, we added duplexes as an eligible property type through the Buyer Initiated Program and also through our acquisition rehab. And that really came from demands from the community as they wanted to have opportunities, in particular for multi-generational living, which then also led us to the accessory dwelling unit. And we were the organization in Minneapolis that created the first new construction accessory dwelling units in 2014 when the city passed some new policy and zoning requirements around accessory dwelling units. The other piece that has really kind of raised its presence in our work is what we have termed, actually what the community termed Project Sustain Legacy. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. So with this new reiteration and the work that we're doing and the production level that we're doing, we are experiencing higher risk, and it's much more cash intensive. So we help about 35 to 40, we have new homeowners a year, and just in the affordability and rehab, that's going anywhere between 2 and 3 million just in the investment through affordability. And if we're doing the new construction, the vacant homes, that's about another 2 to 3 million that we need to have cash flowed. The Home Buyer Initiated program, as I mentioned, continues to be the most requested, and it's one that we look at significantly as we think about scale and how to keep the organization sustainable. It's, I put in quotes, the easiest opportunity to grow and scale, simply because we're helping to facilitate a transaction with a buyer that's coming through, and not where we have to hold a property long-term and try to sell it at the end of rehab. There is deeper affordability investment that's needed in the current market as we try to continue to stay around a 50 to 60% area median income household that we would like to serve. And quite frankly, it's an ongoing puzzle to meet all the funding that's required, to meet all the post-purchase rehab requirements, because more and more layers are being asked of us to take care of in a home, but not necessarily the funding to support it. The Project Sustain Legacy has really been focused on tax forfeited properties, and that's existing current homeowners to stay or transition out of their home. We've helped a dozen households now, and majority of those have been where they're long-term community members that want to stay in their home, but they're looking to risk losing their home simply because of being delinquent on taxes, usually because of some catastrophic life event. So we've been able to put what we consider our affordability investment to satisfy the delinquency, or in some cases headed to foreclosure. The homeowner agrees to put the home in the land trust. The same resale restrictions, the same income restrictions apply upon resale. And then we come in and address what is usually substantial deferred maintenance in the homes. We're also partnering with some local organizations around trying to solve for some of our longer term, more substandard rental property situations in the city of Minneapolis. The other place where we see opportunity for scale and sustainability is really doing some technical assistance, and that's providing and working in partnership with other organizations, often community organizing organizations, cooperatives around land ownership, and offering that technical assistance related to stewarding the affordability and ensuring that properties stay affordable long term. Some of the things that have come out of those partnerships, at least in the feedback, is we have an opportunity to share the credibility that we now have 16 years into this, as well as a balance sheet which can often support other community-based initiatives. Some of the challenges I just wanted to mention was, I think we all experience limited resources, so it's best on how to leverage it. And we talk a lot about trying to make sure that the resources that are invested in our housing are kept affordable long term, and how do we do that in the most effective manner. Regulatory policies, there's a lot of impact that has on CLT projects and our homeowners, quite frankly, and even the ones that come through the tax forfeiture, we're often negotiating in order to get special assessments reduced in order to reduce the cost of acquisition. And then there seems to be a resistance to acknowledge the amount of affordability investment that's needed to really serve lower income households. So we still often get in some pretty spirited discussions about trying to serve lower income households and not just coming up at the maximum threshold of what a public partner has deemed affordable for their funding. And then a lack also of acknowledgement of the true cost to produce. It just seems to be wanting to do more with less, or the reality of this is really what it does take to produce quality housing. And in closing, I'd just like to generally say that this is an amazing strategy for a lot of different community solutions and challenges that we have, but it is hard work, and it's not for the faint of heart. And when we talk about scale and sustainability, that's really important to manage expectations. Unless an organization, a coalition, or a community has substantial amounts of funding and financial and human resources. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. My name is Julia Durante Martinez, and I work at New Economy Project, coordinating our CLT capacity building work, which I'm really excited to talk more about, along with what we've been doing to strengthen collaboration between CLTs here in New York. Arrow? Nope, wrong arrow.
You're close, yeah.
And then can you also press that little
Now we have to
forward?
zoom back. Sorry,
It's the very bottom one.
I'm not quite sure what happened there. Sorry, to keep the mouse very precisely hovered. Okay, here we go. So New Economy Project has been working with groups for more than 20 years to fight for financial and economic justice on issues ranging from predatory lending and abusive debt collection to community land trust, worker and financial cooperatives, and public banking. So our work is really focused on challenging systems and institutions that harm and extract wealth from communities of color and low-income communities, and also supporting equitable community-led development solutions. So our CLT, coalition organizing and capacity building, is an outgrowth of this work to strengthen economic democracy. And in terms of citywide work on CLTs, Greg talked a little bit about this, but New York has a really long history of tenant organizing, housing cooperatives, and mutual housing associations, which are other tools that try to shift power to residents and communities and work towards deeper and longer-term affordability as they're also thinking about ways to reimagine housing and decommodify housing. But CLTs specifically have been kind of underutilized within that landscape. And for several decades, New York City had just one active community land trust, the Cooper Square CLT on the Lower East Side. And this began to change when members of Picture the Homeless, a membership organization led by people currently or formerly experiencing homelessness, started exploring CLTs as a potential solution for homelessness in the city. And Picture the Homeless was joined by New Economy Project, academics, other advocates that were also looking into CLTs. So altogether, these groups founded the New York City Community Land Initiative in 2012. And today, the New York City Community Land Initiative, or NYCLI, is a citywide coalition of more than 24 social justice and housing groups that are united around the principle that housing is a human right. And we're all working to strengthen CLTs, again, as a tool that really addresses the root causes of homelessness and displacement by removing land from the speculative market. So just briefly, kind of the focus areas of NYCLI coalition work includes education and outreach on CLTs to really develop a deeper understanding of the model and the history of the movement among diverse stakeholders, which has been really essential for building momentum. This picture is of a board game that the coalition developed on CLTs and MHAs that helps walk people through the process of what it's like to actually make decisions collectively as a community. There's role-playing cards based on real New Yorkers that were actually involved in getting this movement set up. So this is in line with a focus on popular education and tools that are really accessible and promote, again, real community ownership over what CLTs do. So along with education and outreach, NYCLI does policy advocacy, mostly focused on city and state level policies to strengthen and channel properties to community land trusts. And NYCLI members shaped New York City's first local law on CLTs that defined CLTs locally and allowed them to enter into regulatory agreements with the city, which is a precursor for CLTs accessing the same tax abatements and subsidies as other affordable housing corporations, and have also helped to pass vacant property registry legislation that was championed by Picture the Homeless members, again with an eye to creating more pipelines for properties to CLTs. So after many years of public education and policy advocacy in this coalition building, then CLTs in New York State got a boost in 2017 in the form of $3 million from the State Attorney General's office that were earmarked to support CLTs statewide. And New York City received a portion of that through Enterprise Community Partners. And a larger piece of that funding went to support the Cooper Square CLT, the Interborough CLT, which is proposed as a citywide CLT for New York City, and then the East Harlem El Barrio CLT. And the New Economy Project received a smaller portion of that to coordinate this two-year capacity building initiative called the Learning Exchange. And this is intended for groups in the earlier stages of CLT formation to provide training, a peer exchange of skills and knowledge, and community education support. Oh no, it happened again. Here we go. So this is just a map of the groups that have been part of this Learning Exchange Peer Learning Initiative. New York City's Housing Agency selected 9 groups to participate in this two-year initiative. And again, this is a mixture of the 3 CLTs that I just named, as well as CDCs and affordable housing developers, base building groups, and volunteer-led neighborhood coalitions. CLTs that are part of this learning exchange are also working with mutual housing associations and other nonprofit developers and different nonprofit partners around the city. In terms of what the learning exchange has been focusing on in terms of content and like what we're actually doing, the main activity are monthly intensive workshops for more than 30 people with content developed by a curriculum team that began with the history of the CLT movement and the basic structure, then moved into the incorporation process, different governance models for CLTs, property research tools and resources, community organizing and outreach, looking at the development process and how CLTs around the country approach that differently, and financing for deep affordability. And I think throughout, one of the things that we've really tried to emphasize is an ongoing focus on deep affordability, which for us, we talk about that as like 30% area median income or lower, as well as non-residential uses on CLTs. You know, we often talk about CLTs as a permanently affordable housing tool, which of course they are, and that's hugely important, but there's a number of other neighborhood uses that groups in New York, especially those in communities that have been profoundly impacted by environmental injustice and disinvestment, are also interested in, like green space and community space and cultural space. So that's something that we've tried to really highlight. And then I think along with kind of learning about CLTs really generally, the space has been useful for groups to workshop ideas and plans for their CLT efforts, and to collaborate on outreach and policy analysis. And then really crucially, start working towards citywide coordination among all of these new efforts to reach sustainable scale. And this has always, again, been part of the conversation, but it's really coming into focus now that we're moving into the final stretch of this two-year initiative, which is actually up in June of this year. Just again, you can see we're very excited about board games and other interactive activities as part of this exchange. We've had a lot of guest presentations from other community organizers and affordable housing developers here in New York, and had some exchanges with CLTs regionally and nationally, which has been really helpful. We've also started to do a lot more site visits and walking tours around the city to try to get a deeper appreciation for each other's neighborhood context and work, which I think is really important for maintaining, again, like the community context and ownership over the process as we're also developing this kind of citywide and collective analysis and understanding. That's kind of what we're focused on and how we're doing it. In terms of the outcomes of this capacity building initiative, through having this standing monthly meeting space, and along with their own like individual work that they're doing outside of the space, groups have developed their vision and plans for their CLTs. They're working through the incorporation process, recruiting members for their board and really building those out. Different groups have convened, resident committees and resident councils as part of that process. Groups have also hired staff for their new CLTs to coordinate projects and organizing and outreach, and have been doing their own CLT education and outreach with neighborhood groups, and then defined like the key next steps as well as the remaining needs and gaps after this initial capacity building initiative ends. Several of the groups have also completed their property mapping process and have identified target properties for the CLT. Then there's other groups that are actually currently in negotiation with the city for specific properties to acquire into their CLTs, and hopefully will be wrapped up sometime later this year. But I think too, even more broadly than that, one of the really important outcomes of this process has been building trust and relationships between groups. who are also part of many other coalitions and have really long track records of base building and affordable housing development around the city. But specifically with regard to their CLT efforts and thinking about how we can share capacities and skills, being able to learn more about each other's work and build up those relationships is incredibly important, I think, and key for sustaining that coalition work and any sort of collaborative or capacity sharing model that we hope to build going forward. So that's to say, that the Learning Exchange helped us learn more about CLTs more broadly, but it also helped us learn more about each other and about each other's work, and particular neighborhood challenges and opportunities that different groups are hoping that CLTs will help address, and how to move together on those moving forward. And then I think too, just in terms of some broader, bigger picture takeaways from the work done so far in New York, again, truly affordable housing is central to the interest in CLTs here, but thinking beyond housing to broader needs, including living wage and dignified jobs. Again, I talked about green space earlier, community space, healthy foods. And there's a real potential for CLTs to support all of this and also facilitate meaningful decision-making over land use and community development processes. And there's also, this dovetails really nicely with the strong and growing cooperative movement here in New York. Worker co-ops have really been on the rise, especially in the last couple of years. Cooperative financial institutions, community-owned renewable energy initiatives, and thinking through ways that these can be incorporated into CLTs or that new CLT efforts can partner with some of these ideas. And then I think, another key takeaway, just the importance of ongoing organizing, which was reflected in David's report and in a lot of work on CLTs, but just trying to steward something for 99 years requires ongoing buy-in and community ownership and organizing over the process, which also speaks to, prioritizing youth organizing and the base building piece of the work. And then finally, to the importance of city support for CLTs, but not city control over CLTs. And from what we've seen, CLTs around the country that have been successful have had buy-in and support from public agencies and from the city, but we don't want CLTs to become disconnected from their neighborhood base or kind of lose the fee in the CLT, as you hear a lot, or be absorbed by the city. So that's another thing that we're really conscious of moving forward. And then finally, just looking ahead to kind of key opportunities and challenges for reaching scale sustainably. There's a particularly exciting opportunity with another round of funding from the New York State Attorney General's office that is intended to support collaboration and scaling up for CLTs. So New York City, the New York City's housing agency is applying on behalf of the city for groups here. So that's a really exciting possibility. I think to just what I touched on earlier, but the potential to strengthen collaboration with worker co-ops and cooperative financial institutions and other neighborhood groups. There's many groups around the city outside of the Learning Exchange that are also exploring CLTs, Banana Kelly being one, but there's many other examples. So thinking about a process or model for collaboration that incorporates all of those different efforts. And I think the challenges are very similar to the ones that Stacey just mentioned, but just the need for more resources, particularly to support staffing and startup operations for neighborhood groups and base building groups. To be able to have a dedicated person focused on really incubating the CLT work and helping it get off the ground is huge. And then similarly, the affordability levels that we're interested in seeing don't always match up with what is available city, state, federal level at all. Because if we're looking at 30% area median income in New York is $28,000 a year for a family of three, and most of the subsidy programs don't get to that level. And then I think just thinking through land acquisition and what that looks like, even with trying to acquire publicly owned land for CLTs and having some assistance there, it's still a very slow process. And so how do you keep people engaged as that's playing out and really mobilize folks, which was kind of related to a community organizing question of how do you design like a base building campaign around CLTs and sustain that over time. So these are questions that we keep coming back to, and we're really excited to continue discussing them and developing further proposals for collaboration among CLTs here in New York after the Learning Exchange ends in June. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. So we have time. You passed over to Jenny for Jenny Gaynor from Grounded Solutions. Introduce her organization. Maybe do a lightning round of questions to our experts.
Awesome. So hi, everyone. I am Jenny Gaynor. I'm part of the capacity building team at Grounded Solutions Network. And Grounded Solutions is a national nonprofit organization. We're a membership organization, and our members are supporting housing with lasting affordability. Our members include community land trusts, municipalities, other housing nonprofits like Habitats, anyone who is working towards this goal of creating inclusive communities where housing remains affordable for generations. So, in my effort to do the lightning round of questions, I'll do just the first one we had queued up. And so I think, thank you first for all of the panelists. I think it was really awesome to hear about the work that's going on the ground. And one of the things we talked about when planning was thinking about what kinds of policies will support your work. And I think everyone talked about both the need for scale, sustainability, and policy support so that you can actually get there and make these units affordable to the people you're trying to serve, the people in your community. And so we talked also a lot about how CLTs and CDCs and other affordable housing community stakeholders, like working in coalition, will be essential for those kinds of policy wins. So my lightning round question is, when you think about your work in your community, what one policy would be, or one policy change would be most impactful in bringing the CLT movement to scale? So go, lightning round.
Okay, sure, I'll start. This is Gregory again from Banana Kelly. Well, I think what a lot of folks talked about, right, is that kind of ongoing organizing and base building work that's not necessarily about just like one clear and specific campaign. I think, well, on the one hand, there is like the clear specific campaign that unites a lot of community land trusts, which is acquisition of new land. And I think that's the political will, which we've seen from, Dudley Street in Boston in the case of eminent domain there. It worked out because there was really strong political will to make that land become part of a CLT. So I think on the one hand, like a straight up policy piece is like, how do we scale up and that support from municipalities around acquisition of land and make it a political priority. So I think that's one piece, but then beyond that is kind of the ongoing stewardship and organizing and base building work that's not really about, as Julia was saying, it's not really just like campaign driven. Like sometimes we're just talking about how do we keep folks engaged and involved in the governance of the land, of buildings, of the neighborhood, and how do you fund that work? And I think there's some really good questions about that. And again, I think it's still a question of political priorities. And that side might be less about the municipal government, but also in the funding world. To think about that, like, we're talking about replacing institutions and the structure, the infrastructure for social fabric that's existed for decades but's been dismantled systemically over generations. And so we're really trying to rebuild infrastructure for community building. And what's it going to take to do that? I think those are really important questions to dig into together and think about what does that funding look for, rebuilding that infrastructure.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, I think obviously trying to start up CLTs in a city like New York, or any high-cost city, comes with an enormous amount of challenges, just with the scale of the affordability crisis here and displacement that's happening. But I also think the fact that we do have such dense networks of different organizations with all this amazing experience and expertise, from community groups to radical planners, to organizers, tenant associations. I think there's a real opportunity in terms of building out these partnerships and recognizing that none of the CLTs that are starting up are doing this work alone. Most CLTs around the country don't do their work alone either. So recognizing and valuing, I think, those types of partnerships and and relationship development, and really providing support to cultivate those, I think is key for on the part of funders or key providers, and also public sector agencies. Like that is a real part of the work that takes time and resources, and it's really essential, I think, in guaranteeing the long-term sustainability of CLTs, and also thinking, maybe reframing a little bit what we mean when we're talking about getting to scale. Like getting to scale isn't only about acquiring a certain number of units, it's also about having real meaningful community ownership of the process, and that deep kind of investment that comes from really strong relationships and partnerships.
And this is Stacy, and the one that came to mind, excuse me, when I was thinking about this, and one that I've seen manifest over the last couple of years in Minneapolis, are policies around long-term affordability. So while we've had direct buyer assistance programs and different rehab programs and different elements for city funding, in the last 2 years, the conversation has really shifted to that long-term investment, and how do we have impact over a longer term and not just necessarily with one household, and what are the strategies and the tools that we can use. And so I think it's the focus on long-term affordability, whatever that policy may look like, and also around ownership. I went as maybe at the same level of rental, but at least elevating that conversation around long-term affordable home ownership in relation to how we're having the conversation around affordable rental as well.
Thanks, Stacy. And now I'm guessing we're not going to have time for the second question, but I did want to put the plug that if you're interested in learning more about the CLT model, we've got a lot of resources at groundedsolutions.org. We have online training events coming up that could support you in your work. So I wanted to make sure that you all shared and got to see this information, and happy to turn it back over to you folks to close it out.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thanks to Julia, Stacy, and Gregory for a great panel. We're a little bit over time. We'll make an effort for those who wrote in comments to direct them to our panelists, so we might be able to respond offline. But thanks very much for attending. Have a good afternoon.